It was a day in which we saw more of the same, something completely different, and then, yes, more of the same again. It began with Liz Truss telling a slightly startled audience that she had been absolutely right about everything.
In just a short period, this government has acted urgently and decisively on the side of hard-working families and businesses.
Then, after she offered her resignation to the King after all of 49 days in office, Rishi Sunak made the journey of his life all of 7 years after entering Parliament to make history as the King asked him to be Prime Minister. Then came the something different, a man walking alone up the street with no supporters in sight to warn us soberly of the depth of the trouble we are in.
Right now, our country is facing a profound economic crisis.
He promised he would show compassion, but that we needed to know that help from the state would have limits.
I will place economic stability and confidence at the heart of this government's agenda. This will mean difficult decisions to come.
And then tonight we were back to more of the same again. A new cabinet that looks a lot like the old one, with even the Home Secretary, who was forced to resign days ago over a security breach, reappointed. Rampant food inflation, pasta up 60%, bread 40%, as the pain of the cost of living crisis intensifies.
Every time you go to the shop, something's gone up, or nearly everything really.
And in other news, America at war, a special report on the sheer number of Americans who are losing faith in democracy.
It is the biggest fake election, and everybody knows it.
Your soldiers ready to go to war. We have to overwhelm them. Because I'm going to tell you, they're going to cheat again.
From Downing Street, this is ITV News at 10 with Tom Bradby.
Just when politics was supposed to be calming down, just when we thought we were done with surprises, they kept on coming. So, good evening again from Downing Street, where if there are any more changes of government, we'll all be moving in and measuring up the curtains. Standing out here earlier today, Rishi Sunak took the unusual step of criticising his predecessor Liz Truss. She had made mistakes, he said, which he would try to fix. There were surprises too in his cabinet choices. Last week's Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, forced out by Ms Truss, is back in the very same job tonight, a mere 6 days later. Less of a surprise, Jeremy Hunt stayed in place as Chancellor. But who'd have thought that serial Secretary of State Michael Gove would be back in charge of levelling up? Oh, and Gavin Williamson has returned to government too. This morning, Liz Truss left Downing Street and the political stage 7 weeks to the day since she was appointed by the Queen. She was sticking to her guns, still making the case for going for growth. She seemed decidedly cheery. Hard to know what to make of that, to be honest. Mr Sunak, though, was under no illusions. He has to work to restore trust. The UK faces a profound economic crisis, he said.
A new British Prime Minister, the third in less than 4 months, the youngest in more than 200 years, the first British Asian at number 10, and trying to clear up the mother of all messes.
Right now, our country is facing a profound economic crisis.
And then he did something unusual. He put the boot into his immediate Tory predecessor, Liz Truss.
I admired her restlessness to create change. But some mistakes were made. Not born of ill will or bad intentions. Quite the opposite, in fact. But mistakes nonetheless.
And there's a price for filling the £40 billion hole in the public finances that she passed on to him.
This will mean difficult decisions to come. But you saw me during COVID doing everything I could to protect people and businesses with schemes like furlough. There are always limits, more so now than ever. But I promise you this, I will bring that same compassion to the challenges we face today. The government I lead will not leave the next generation, your children and grandchildren, with a debt to settle that we were too weak to pay ourselves.
What followed was a dig at the Prime Minister immediately before Truss, Boris Johnson, who was seen by many as untrustworthy.
This government will have integrity, professionalism, and accountability at every level. I understand how difficult this moment is. And I understand too that I have work to do to restore trust after all that has happened.
Earlier, Rishi Sunak was appointed Prime Minister by King Charles, whose great-great-great-grandmother, Queen Victoria, ruled India, and who was today anointing as head of government someone proud of his Indian ancestry and heritage. How things change. But till Liz Truss went to the palace, there wasn't a vacancy. And while she nattered to the monarch for a full half hour, she kept Sunak waiting. And another record set today. Out of office after just 50 days. The shortest term ever for a Prime Minister.
It has been a huge honour to be Prime Minister of this great country.
But after all that chaos of her 7 weeks at the helm, not a hint of remorse, no apology.
As the Roman philosopher Seneca wrote, it's not because things are difficult that we do not dare. It's because we do not dare that they are difficult. We simply cannot afford to be a low-growth country where the government takes up an increasing share of our national wealth.
You might have thought she wouldn't have mentioned the T word for tax given the turmoil in markets. After she cut them, think again.
It means lower taxes so people can keep more of the money that they earn. And it means delivering growth that will lead to more job security, higher wages, and greater opportunities for our children and grandchildren.
But it was goodbye from her.
I wish Rishi Sunak every success for the good of our country. I know that brighter days lie ahead. Thank you.
So, you remember those difficult decisions Sunak just warned us about? He meant that this man, Jeremy Hunt, reconfirmed as Chancellor, has just 6 days to fill the public finance hole left behind by Truss with tax rises and public spending cuts. But what about Sunak's pledge to govern with integrity and responsibility? Well, some question whether that was just words after he reappointed Suella Braverman as Home Secretary 6 days after she was sacked for a breach of security and confidentiality.
Point of order, Yvette Cooper.
Braverman's opposite number isn't inclined to give the Prime Minister the benefit of the doubt.
And how on earth does it meet standards of integrity, professionalism to reappoint someone who's just broken the ministerial code, just breached all standards of professional behaviour in a great office of state? It just looks as if the new Prime Minister has put party before country, and our national security and public safety are too important for this.
So, if as he posed before going into number 10 he hardly looked chipper,
Cheer up, Rishi.
can you blame him? Robert Peston, News at 10.
The game of musical chairs that passes for a cabinet reshuffle these days turns out to have been more interesting and more revealing than expected. First, there are those who served under Liz Truss who will sit in Rishi Sunak's cabinet. As Robert mentioned, Jeremy Hunt remains as Chancellor. Moving him was surely unthinkable. Also staying, Ben Wallace at Defence and James Cleverly as Foreign Secretary. Both supported Liz Truss in the summer and Boris Johnson this time, an attempt to bridge the divide in the party, something his predecessor was criticised for failing to do. There was the controversial return of Suella Braverman, effectively sacked as Home Secretary less than a week ago and accused of breaching ministerial rules, who now returns to the very same job. Do not pass go, do not collect £200. And then there are also ministers who have been brought back into cabinet who served under Boris Johnson. Dominic Raab is back to his old roles, Justice Secretary, and more interestingly, Deputy Prime Minister. Oliver Dowden, who quit under Boris Johnson, has been appointed Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. And Michael Gove, who has served under every Prime Minister since David Cameron and had more political resurrections than Lazarus, returns to his old job as Levelling Up Secretary.
Walking back through the door of number 10 just 16 weeks after he walked out of number 11. Rishi Sunak's first task to piece together who's joining him around the top table. A lap of honour past the cameras for those who got the call.
Will you be rewarded for your loyalty? Mr. Cleverly, are you staying in the same role?
Good afternoon, nice
Good
to see
afternoon.
you. Thank you very much.
This is a cabinet knitted together from sides. Return some, even back with time. So while Hunt remains as Chancellor and Boris Johnson backer James Cleverly stays in position as Foreign Secretary, long-standing ally Dominic Raab is rewarded with Deputy Prime Minister and Justice Secretary, and the surprise appointment of Suella Braverman as Home Secretary, despite her recent sacking. Leadership rival Penny Mordaunt keeps her job as Leader of the House of Commons. Ben Wallace will also stay put at the Ministry of Defence, and Grant Shapps replaces Jacob Rees-Mogg as Business Secretary. Steve Barclay returns to deal with the challenges of the Department of Health. This former party leader said the Prime Minister's choices were driven by one overriding criteria.
When I've talked to him more recently, he was very clear. He wants to get people who can do the job. Number one. In other words, people who've got the talent. And he's also said he needs to get people who have experience, a balance of experience and new blood coming in rather than just new blood.
Earlier, Liz Truss led her final cabinet meeting, applause from them that's been strikingly absent anywhere else. By this evening, these ministers, including the former Chief Whip, Education and Justice Secretaries, will be joining her on the back benches, and there may be more to come.
This is the parade of those who've been rewarded, like James Cleverly here, those who are coming back into government and those who are staying put. Rishi Sunak has promised a government of all the talents. With 2 years to turn things around, he's going to need it.
It's a cabinet with an emphasis on continuity.
Mr. Hunt, are you pleased to be Chancellor? Will you give us a few words?
With even some of Liz Truss's most loyal lieutenants like Therese Coffey getting roles. And surprisingly little room for new faces as Rishi Sunak opted for experience.
Are you happy with the new role?
Yeah, delighted, yeah. There's a lot of things to do here and obviously some very, very big issues.
Although of his leadership rivals, Penny Mordaunt didn't get a bigger job, and there's nothing so far for Boris Johnson. Unity has its limits. Romilly Weeks, News at 10.
Well, lots of not very chatty cabinet ministers there walking past us as they came out, maybe no surprise. Robert, another day, yet another quite a day, I think one would say. Can we just talk about the cabinet first? Is it surprising? Were you surprised at all? Kind of the sort of slightly weird combination of mostly old faces in some new roles, but mostly not?
Well, there were some surprises. I was struck by what Yvette Cooper said. She accused Rishi Sunak of putting party before country in reinstating, for example, Suella Braverman, who breached the ministerial code only 6 days ago, normally would be out of office for 6 months, back after 6 days. But just to be clear, the whole point of this cabinet is to put party before country in the short term, because Rishi Sunak can achieve nothing at all if his party is at war. And he's got some incredibly difficult decisions to take, which we'll get on to in a minute. So it was intentionally a cabinet formed to try to stop the warfare. Now, you mentioned there are 3 great Boris supporters still in the cabinet, but he did also sack 3 very enthusiastic Boris Johnson supporters, Jacob Rees-Mogg, Kit Malthouse and Jake Berry. Yeah. And if, which I think is more than an if, probably quite likely, at some point Boris Johnson becomes a focus of opposition to Rishi Sunak, the fact that they are on the backbenches could be a source of trouble for Sunak.
OK, let's talk about those big challenges, because we've now got a massive hole in the public finance. We've got inflation figures today, which we'll come on to talk about, which are frankly horrifying. What do you make of his in-trade?
Well, it's as bad as you could possibly imagine. He talked about a profound economic crisis, and that's to prepare us for some very big tax rises and spending cuts next Monday. Jeremy Hunt is back in the Treasury, hard at work at something that's not called a budget, but will be more important to all of us than most budgets, and it will be painful. There will be very little about it that will be populist, because it will be all about belt tightening to fill that £40 billion hole in the public finances which Liz Truss left as a present for Rishi Sunak. Well, you can see the bonus for Rishi Sunak in filling that gap, which is that bond prices, the effective interest rate the government pays, the interest rate that we pay, is now back to levels that they were before the mini-budget. But if Jeremy Hunt and Rishi Sunak were to disappoint investors, they would shoot right up again.
OK, Robert, we'll pick that up later. Now, the market makers who helped bring down Liz Truss after her mini-budget much prefer the cut of Rishi Sunak's jib. As Robert was just saying, he'd warned, hadn't he, of what Liz Truss's tax cutting might do. Well, now he's in Downing Street. Interest rates on long-term government borrowing are indeed back below where they were before her Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng announced those ill-fated and unfunded tax cuts. Still, Mr Sunak will need all his economic experience and brain power to figure out what to do about the black hole in Britain's finances.
The economy is on fire with inflation, and Rishi Sunak says he understands.
I fully appreciate how hard things are.
He promises to protect us, but warns the government cannot afford to absorb all of the pain.
There are always limits, more so now than ever.
So is more help on the way for people and businesses? Almost certainly not. Inflation has been driven to a 40-year high, and Vanessa Thomas is feeling it. This winter, the government will subsidise her energy bills and everyone else's, but thereafter, support has been cut back.
I don't think people can live like this for very long. It's got to come. There's going to be a breaking point. I don't know what we're going to do.
Difficult decisions lie ahead because the government has committed itself to balancing day-to-day spending and to getting debt falling as a share of GDP in 3 years' time. Now, high inflation, rising interest rates and a looming recession make that task much, much harder. Around £30 billion probably needs to be found from somewhere, and the financial markets are watching. So will taxes rise to raise that £30 billion? Reversing Liz Truss's national insurance cut could bring in up to £18 billion a year. Reversing her stamp duty cut would raise much less. The Chancellor could freeze income tax thresholds for longer, and he could go for bigger windfall taxes.
There might be a tax on the banks to reflect the fact that their profits are being swelled by higher interest rates. Obviously, taxes on energy companies who are doing well out of the current spike in energy prices is another area that you might choose to go.
Rishi Sunak promises a stronger NHS, but will there be cuts to public spending? Services are already under enormous strain. Hospitals, schools, prisons, the courts and local authorities have seen their budgets squeezed tightly by inflation.
You're seeing a range of public services really struggling. We'll see some cuts potentially to overseas aid, we'll see some cuts to investment spending, which wouldn't help growth, but there are difficult choices here for the Chancellor.
Difficult choices, and investors will be watching closely. So will the markets stay calm? The pound strengthened again today and the government's borrowing costs fell. The credibility that Liz Truss lost is being restored.
It has been mostly restored. I say mostly, but we should not forget that there's been real damage. There are people who couldn't buy their homes. There are first-time buyers that are still locked out of the mortgage market. We haven't counted yet the damage that has been created in this month of unthinkable developments for a G7 economy.
Back at the Treasury today was Rupert Harrison. George Osborne's former Chief of Staff is now advising Jeremy Hunt. The Osborne years were all about austerity. What happens next may feel very similar. Joel Hills, News at 10.
The new Prime Minister said during his speech at the lectern here that he fully appreciates how hard things are for people. He hopes it is a message that will be heard in places that elected a Conservative MP in 2019 in traditionally Labour areas. But in Worksop, in Nottinghamshire, in the Red Wall seat of Bassetlaw, some voters aren't so sure that Mr Sunak really understands.
In the midst.
It was the speech so many have been waiting to hear, especially for these volunteers spending their time helping others struggling with the rising cost of living.
I fully appreciate how hard things are.
I just wish he would come down.
It would be good to have him here, actually. Come and meet the people that we're
see
trying to support.
how people are struggling.
People like these pensioners who say they daren't put their heating on, getting a discounted hot meal to help cope with the cold. They say they can't understand how Rishi Sunak can truly know how it feels to need support like this.
I just hope that he realises that he's all right because he's got plenty of money and we're all on pension. So we have to be more and more careful these days.
I just despair. Really, I do. OK, Rishi Sunak is now Prime Minister, but what do we really know of him?
There you go. Would you like cabbage?
And people at this community food hub wonder what he really knows of them. As people struggle to make ends meet, it's not just lifestyles that are changing, but plans for the future too.
Have sandwich instead.
Annette Voice has recently retired, and queuing for lower-priced fruit and veg isn't how she hoped her days would be.
Aren't they meant to be, when you retire, the glory years or whatever the time of your life? You know, I wanted to be able to say we could just go out somewhere and go in a coffee shop and whatever, but
it's normal things.
Exactly, because electric and everything's going up. You've got to cut back where you can.
Hoping she can help is mother of two, Rosie, who manages this service. She says every day she speaks to families who are struggling, just like she is.
Rishi Sunak today has said that he understands what people are going through. Do you feel that that's true?
I don't think anybody with that way of life understands what we are going through.
Is it hard protecting your children from that as well? I know that you're here today with them. Is it hard protecting them from feeling the knock-on effects of that?
Yes, it is, because you try to hide that. You don't want your children to see that you're struggling.
A struggle that these friends are now having to adjust to. They've seen many Prime Ministers come and go, just never like this.
Do you think Rishi will make some better decisions? Or
Hopefully.
yeah.
Couldn't have made many worse.
Well, today he's promised to make things better, to fix the mistakes of his predecessor. Now he just has to prove it. Sangeeta Lal, News at 10, Worksop.
Well, the cost of living crisis, which we saw in Sangeeta's report, is affecting some of the most basic of supermarket buys the most. Not exactly winning support for a Conservative government, whether or not it is to blame. Figures out today show prices of some basic foods like pasta and vegetable oil have gone up by 2/3, yes, you did hear that correctly, 2/3 in the past year. Chips, bread and biscuits are up more than 1/3.
As cheap as chips, now an outdated concept. New figures show that even the very basics of our national diet are spiralling in price. And in this Birmingham cafe, we met Brenda Jones. Like so many others, she's struggling to keep up with what the cost of living is dishing out.
Every time you go to the shop, something's gone up, or nearly everything really. And you go to the cheaper brands, so that you can make your money, stretch a bit further,
Officials tracked 30 of the cheapest grocery items over the last 12 months. Overall food inflation is at 15%, but these lowest price supermarket versions are actually up more, 17%. Even the cheapest vegetable oil is up 65%, and the most basic tea by almost half. Pasta up 23p to 61, bread up 18p to 66p, and the cheapest coffee up 24p to £1.55. And of course, week after week, this all adds up. Ingredients made from cereals or cooking oils are hit by the war in Ukraine.
What we've shown
is that the impact on those people, typically at the lower end of the income spectrum, who cannot, if you like, drop down to buy anything cheaper, is going to be high.
Many shoppers are shifting to own brands, but there's growing pressure on supermarkets to do more.
When it reaches the stage that even the cheapest food isn't cheap anymore, we know we've got a problem. Is there something that supermarkets can do?
Supermarkets really need to step up to the plate for their consumers, and that means getting these budget essential items into the stores where people actually need them, and spend some of their promotion and marketing budget on these essential, affordable, healthy food.
Even when you opt for the very cheapest shopping, there's no escape from rising costs. On little labels, there are ever bigger prices. Chris Choi, News at 10.
The children's nurse, who is on trial for killing 7 of her poorly little patients, only came under suspicion, the court was told today, when a medical expert spotted a disturbing and unusual pattern of baby deaths. Lucy Letby worked at the Countess of Chester Hospital, where Dr. Dewey Evans was asked to investigate 33 cases. In one, he found the cause of death was an injection of air into the blood that could not, because of the safeguards in place, have been an accident. Miss Letby denies 7 murders and 10 attempted murders. There have been plenty of demands for a general election here, that letting people vote is more democratic than relying on Conservative MPs to choose a new Prime Minister. Across the Atlantic, claims that democracy is under assault are growing as they prepare for big elections there. In the so-called midterms, Congress, men and women and several state governors are campaigning hard. Among them are Trump-supporting Republicans who are already saying next month's elections will be rigged against them by Democrats, just as they claim the presidential election was stolen from Donald Trump.
In just 2 weeks, it is election day in America again. This time it is a critical battle for control of Congress.
We're not going to take it anymore, Arizona!
Everywhere you look, there are Republican candidates like Carrie Lake, who are embracing the corrosive idea that the upcoming election may be fraudulent.
The only way they can win is if they load up the voter rolls with dead people, people who've moved, and imaginary friends.
She is running to be governor of Arizona, a rising star of the Republican Party and one of the most prominent election deniers.
This fake news wants us divided.
She is a former news anchor who now has contempt for the media.
Keep your hands up. Turn around. America is waking up to your lies.
It's all part of the long shadow of 2020, when election fraud claims and political violence stalked America. 2 of those who oversaw the 2020 vote in Arizona, election supervisors Clint Hickman and Bill Gates, have given ITV access to the voicemails and the vitriol that they still receive.
Kate, you liar. We know about you taking the bribes. We're going to hang you, traitor. We know what you're hiding. We'll be coming to get you and your families.
They worry that 2020 set the precedent.
There was a guillotine set up at the Arizona State Capitol for us.
On the eve of these midterm elections, they are now more worried than ever before about the state of American democracy.
If we are going to continue to follow leadership based on untruths, lies, and violence, that's what I'm scared of.
People have got to stand for more than their party, stand for more than their tribe, and unfortunately, we're going in the wrong direction. I do believe that our democracy it's teetering right now.
Thank you, President Pierce.
Mark Fincham is a conspiracy theorist running to be Arizona's Secretary of State.
We are facing an existential threat to the Republic.
A post that would ironically put him in charge of election integrity.
Do you still believe the 2020 presidential election was stolen?
Yeah, I think it was a fraud.
Arizona State Representative
Donald Trump is watching approvingly as these election deniers vie for power.
Great job, Mark.
Fincham wrongly says that voter fraud is widespread.
The media wants to call it a conspiracy theory. That's what they call something that they don't like, rooted in fact. If they just put a label on it, conspiracy theory, somehow it'll go away. It's not going away.
God bless you and God bless America.
America's democracy feels increasingly fragile. And here's the problem. Tens of millions of Americans no longer believe elections can be trusted.
3, 2, 1, Trump!
And they are whipped up and mobilized by Donald Trump's inner circle.
This was the biggest con job. It is the biggest fake election, and everybody knows it.
Your soldiers ready to go to war. We have to overwhelm them. Because I'm going to tell you, they're going to cheat again. There's cheating.
The election deniers may create chaos in these midterm elections. But all of this just foreshadows the presidential race in 2 years' time. By then, Trump's allies will not be watching from the sidelines, but maybe in positions of power.
Thank you so much, President Trump. Do we love this man or what?
Robert Moore, News at 10, Arizona.
Well, I'm told Robert's full documentary is absolutely startling. I'm going to go home and watch it after this, and you can too, after the news, in the first of a new series of our Exposure Current Affairs programme. That's America, The War Within on ITV shortly, and a little later on STV. And I've also recorded a podcast with Robert about the very same programme, and that's gobsmacking too. You can find it on our website or wherever you get your podcast from. Really, really, I would urge you to listen. Well worth your time. Now let's come back to our slightly less dramatic but nevertheless dramatic day. What are your final thoughts on yet another kind of remarkable day in British politics?
Well, I suppose what's weighing on me to an extent is this. We've had 3 prime ministers in 4 months. We had those massive tax cuts, market crash, tax rises, more tax rises to come, spending cuts to come, and yet there's probably not going to be an election for a couple of years. But it does feel desperately fragile. And I think lots of British people don't understand why, after all this chaos, they're going to have to wait another couple of years to pass judgment. And I think that explains why we saw a very different kind of performance today from Rishi Sunak from what we normally see with a new Prime Minister. Austere. He turns up, and as you pointed out, no one here was cheering, no fans, no supporters. His wife and his children are nowhere to be seen. He's positioning himself as simply getting on with the job. He used that phrase, there's a profound economic crisis, and I think his best hope of staying in power is to persuade his MPs and the British people that there is an urgent crisis and that he has the tools to deal with it, but it will be fragile for a while.
Okay, Robert. Thank you very much indeed. So Rishi Sunak, who thought he was down and out of the race for Downing Street 2 months ago, today entered the record books as Britain's 57th Prime Minister. If only because of the chaos her policies cause, Liz Truss will always be more than a footnote in history, but may not merit a whole chapter of her own. In generations to come, in pub quizzes or Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, she will be remembered as the answer to that shaming question: which Prime Minister had the shortest time in office? On his first day in number 10, Rishi Sunak can't know what his legacy will be, of course. He wants, he says, to lead our country into the future and achieve incredible things. He's certainly got his work cut out. And that is it from Downing Street. Hopefully it will be a while before there's any need to come back, but you never know. Good night and thanks for watching.
He inherits a very difficult to-do list.